We know the numbers. More than 100,000 cases of COVID in Massachusetts. More than 1,500 cases here in the Cape. The virus hovers above our days, shaping our behaviors, shaping our worldview. But for some, the abstraction of a pandemic became painfully real. Truro's Julian Cyr knows that firsthand. The antibodies in his blood confirmed what he already suspected. He's gone one-on-one with the coronavirus.
Started off with a lot of fatigue and a little swollenness in my glands. It manifested into a pretty intense fever that I had for 2.5 days. I didn't develop a cough per se, but I developed a tightness in my lungs if I took a deep, deep breath. So I could breathe normally, but if I would sort of try to take a deep sort of yogic, relaxing breath, you could really feel it. You could feel a tightness in your lungs there. I did not lose my sense of taste or my sense of smell, which is a telltale symptom of COVID. And so my acute symptoms were about 3 days. But I was pretty knocked out and pretty fatigued and tired for a solid week.
That happened in March. He had friends in the Cape who tested positive for COVID. It took until now to get confirmation of what he suspected.
Went and got an antibody test. It's a blood draw. On a Monday, I went to Outer Cape Health in Provincetown, got a blood draw at 3:30 p.m. And by 10 a.m. the next morning, I got a public health nurse who's with the VNA of Cape Cod, a wonderful nurse named Jane, who shared my results that I indeed did have COVID antibodies. I actually highly suspected that I had symptoms that were consistent with COVID in early mid-March. It was so early in the pandemic that actually testing for COVID was only available for people who were so gravely and acutely ill that they were having to be admitted to the emergency department. Of course, we don't exactly know what having antibodies means, aside from saying that my body came into contact with COVID. I had a reaction to it. I was able to fight it off, and I got better. It's not sort of a definitive kind of message about or information about I have immunity or anything like that.
Luckily, the timing of Cyr's symptoms suggested he was already self-quarantining during what, in hindsight, would be the contagious stage. When his friends were diagnosed, in an abundance of caution, he hunkered down. But his story illustrates how easily the virus can spread. There, but for the spin of fate, could go any of us.
Incredibly fortunate. One, that I was, self-quarantining at the time already. That two, that my symptoms were, ones that I could manage at home. These are serious symptoms, and how it can become very scary, especially because at the time there was so much that we didn't know. And I was really sort of worried at the time, that I might, did I make anyone else sick? Did I come into contact with people? We now know that you're contagious sort of 2 days before the onset of symptoms. So my symptoms happened on the evening of March 16th. So Saturday, March 14th, I would have been contagious. So fortunately, that was long after I had been with my family, that I had caucus with my colleagues, that I had that district day where I came into contact with so many people. The COVID-19 pandemic, actually, for me, as someone who is spent a lot of my career in public health, as someone who is queer and who grew up here on the Outer Cape, and sort of grew up in and sort of lived through the AIDS epidemic, is that there's a lot of kind of echoes to that, right? So what was so hard about this was, you didn't know you didn't know if you had it, you didn't know how you got it, you didn't know who you would infect, and so the anxiety about that and the sort of real fear and guilt around that, honestly, after the worst of my symptoms subsided, one outcome I had is that I became very depressed. I kind of went into a pretty deep depression for a good sort of solid week after my symptoms had, my most acute symptoms had subsided. And, I think a lot of that in part was, really feeling isolated and scared and not knowing, what you could have contracted, who you could have, put into harm's way. There was sort of a very memorable moment where, when I started sort of doing this quarantine, even in advance of having symptoms, I think my dad sort of dropped by some food for me, and we couldn't hug each other, and I never not hugged my parents, right? And so, that honestly was a real, as difficult a part of this. Fortunately, it appears that no one in my family got sick. None of the my constituents that I had been in a lot of contact with sort of the prior week, they wouldn't have been exposed. It certainly gave me a perspective, I think, that I wouldn't have had